do that. They'd like that.
I think it would be a good connection.
Yeah.
It's the only bridge in the whole Bible.
It is. It's a bridge because they do them.
You want me to get more?
Use the red ones, but the blue ones are a little better. The pages are different. That's it. Yeah.
What are you teaching?
Whatever you have. Bring me one red one, and I can switch the pages back and forth. It's all right. We're good.
I'm happy to do that for you. What are you teaching?
Yeah, no, it's fine. We're just gonna teach. I'm just gonna teach from it. We're only gonna do a couple of pages. Okay.
If you don't have blue, you can use red.
Here, just leave me the red one there. I have one. Thanks. All right, good morning, everyone. Boker Tov. Good Shabbos. Okay, good morning, good morning, good morning. Oh. Good morning, good morning. Sha. Tough crowd here. Good morning. I hope everybody's well this morning. Wish you Shabbat Shalom. Welcome. It's good to have everyone here together. Springtime has come. It's so taka nice outside. It's just glorious. It's just wonderful. Okay, good to have you here. Shabbat Shalom. Following our Torah study, of course, you're all welcome. There's about 18 things going on in the building. Services, regular Shabbat prayers in the Sher Lapandi. There's a meditation minyan in here. Following services at about 11:30, quarter to 12, our speaker this morning is Adam Milstein, who's the founder of the IAC, the Israeli American Council, and he's interested these days in the growth of anti-Semitism in America and abroad, and he'll be talking to us about that this morning. And then following that, we'll have lunch, and then after lunch, a conversation with Adam about his activism in that area. Yeah? Parsha discussion at 10:30 today, an early Parsha. It's a short Parsha, so yeah, bring your bib, because it's all about Fleshik's animal parts. It's good. Come on in. This coming week, this is Purim. No, next week is Purim, right? Purim is a week. This week? Is it this week? I get my weeks mixed up. Yeah, this week is Purim. So Wednesday night is Purim. It's the best holiday of the year, especially if you slog through Yom Kippur. You get Purim as a bonus. So for small kids, it's early. For older folks, it's a little bit later. This is the 50th anniversary of Woodstock. Cantor Barron was there, although he doesn't remember much of it. So Cantor Barron has created a special tribute to Woodstock Purim service. So put on your tie-dye and your headbands and your bangles and your beads, right? At home, do whatever inebriate you find holy. And he's rewritten all the Woodstock songs to Pesach songs. I'm sorry, Purim songs, Pesach songs too, and Purim songs, right. So they're very funny. They're actually very funny, and we'll sing them through all the songs. We'll sing through the songs. So please come and join. It's really a lot of fun, and it's sweet, and
Is that Wednesday night?
it's Wednesday night. Wednesday night. About what time is it? 6:30, 7? Yeah. Little kids earlier because it's a little bit less crowded with the little kids, and then for bigger kids and for grown-ups, it's at 7, and it'll be very joyful. And then Thursday morning, if you want to come back and hear the Megillah again, we'll do it all over again. Or you can come to the airport?
I'm leaving.
Oh, I'm sorry. So why would you do with the Megillah at the airport?
Is it going to be streamed?
Everything's streamed. I don't know if it'll be streamed because they're doing it in Glazer, and I don't know if they stream from that room. So I don't know. We'll see. This I don't know, but maybe not. I don't know. Okay, so that's Purim. Come enjoy Purim, and then 4 weeks from now is Pesach. So it's time to start cleaning the kitchen. Good God. Yeah. And as always, I have an ongoing contest of the most interesting Passover product you can find. Okay, so every year we have this contest, and we've had some wonderful winners, right? We had Rabbi Shulweiss won one year. He brought his wife. He went to New York, left her at home to clean the house by herself. When he returned, he showed her a present. It was kosher for Passover lipstick. He was not amused. And then one year it was my former son-in-law brought gefilte fish, gummy fish candies. Gefilte fish flavored gummy candies. For every child that loves a taste of gefilte fish all day long. My dear friend Murray brought me I think Billy, charoset flavored ice cream from Ben & Jerry's. Last year the winner wasn't food. It was an object. It was a toilet seat cover for Passover. You cover your toilet seat. It looks like matzah, and it had the words, "Let my people go." Murray brought me fettuccine Alfredo, kosher for Passover, just like our ancestors ate while they were fleeing Pharaoh. So if you're in the market, you're in the world, and you find a product and you say, "Oh my God," don't buy it. Just take a picture of it. If you have to buy it, buy it. But take a picture and send me the picture, and I'll enter you in the contest, and you too will have Valley Beth Shalom immortality. Yeah, Rabbi Gelman, our dear friend Rabbi Gelman, is launching a new class. We're going to be studying the book of Psalms, and it's
Psalm Enchanted Evening.
Psalm Enchanted Evening. That's so clever. What nights, Billy?
Tuesday nights, 5 or 6 classes.
Starting when?
7 o'clock.
Starting what time?
7 p.m.
7 p.m. Tuesday. What date?
Tuesday, March 26th.
March 26th, Tuesday. We'll put this out. You'll get it out. And everyone's invited. It's free. It'll be streamed, so if you're home alone, you want... No?
Not yet.
It will be. We're working on it.
Work in progress.
We're going to try that. Yeah, please.
And Asher is performing at HAU on the 31st.
Ash, our wonderful musician in residence. Good. Okay. In the Torah this week, we begin a new book. We begin the book of Vayikra. The first section of the book of Vayikra is a very technical section which describes the sacrificial worship that took place in the Torah's narrative at the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, the portable shrine, and eventually in the Temple of Jerusalem, in the Beit HaMikdash. It's very technical stuff, and goes through all of the sort of techniques, the various kinds of sacrifices. But I thought what would be better than doing that would be to do what the rabbis did, which is to replace sacrifice with prayer, and to spend the next several weeks talking about the prayer book. So we're going to go through a very tough, intricate study of the prayer book together, and try to understand how this kind of worship took the place of sacrifice and what it means. Okay? So if you happen to have the blue prayer book, not everyone does, I know, but if you happen to have the blue prayer book, turn to page 104. If you don't have the blue prayer book, don't worry. It's just going to be one line. I just want to get one line out there. Well, 2 lines. Ready? Shh. The impulse to pray. The impulse to worship. You want to come in? We got chairs. We need more seats. Come in. We got room. You guys want to come on in? There's some room. We got a chair over here. Come on. 2 on the aisle. 2 on the aisle. I used to be at Maitre D. There you go. Okay. The impulse to worship. The impulse to worship is, according to the tradition, a very natural impulse. Okay, the line on page 104 is a prayer that is said early in the morning when you first start the Sabbath prayers. When you first start the Sabbath prayers, before you get into the very important stuff of the Shema and the prayers, this is introductory prayer, and the line is, Nishmat kol chai tivarech et shimcha. The breath of everything that's alive will praise God, or praises God. The sense here is that worship is the most natural thing in the world. It's as natural as breathing. To walk the world and experience the miracles of life, and to stop on occasion and reflect, and express a word of gratitude to the Creator. To walk the world and find need, a gap, and something that we can't get past, and to stop and ask for the help of the Creator. To walk the world and do something wrong and carry a sense of guilt and ask for expiation, for cleansing. This is the most natural thing that human beings do. And the notion is that no one had to teach us how to do this. This is what it means to be alive, not even human. It's just everything in the morning gets up and prays. And the idea is that if you could really listen carefully, and in the mystical tradition, they play upon this so beautifully, you could hear the trees praying and the birds praying. You could hear the song of life fill the world, because this is the most natural thing in the world. It is spontaneous, it is personal, it comes from deep inside of the very condition of being alive in the world. The text we read last week, those of you who were with us, of Hannah, the birth of Samuel's story. So Hannah is this woman who is barren, she has no children, and she goes into the Mishkan and she pours out her heart. This becomes the paradigm. Someone in need. And then when she has the child, there's an act of gratitude. The idea is that this is just normal. This is what we are. It didn't occur to the biblical mind that human beings could be any other way. I mean, when Noah comes out of the ark, without anybody telling him what or how to do it, he offers a sacrifice to God. The sense in which you pour out your heart before the Creator, because this is what we do, we human beings do. This is the premise of the whole conversation. But the question is, in what medium? With what technique? So now, if you look at the second paragraph, if those of you have the blue book, and I promise you we're not going to do too much more in the blue book, the second paragraph is another prayer, which is sort of a commentary on the first. And the second paragraph discusses this. So it says, Ilu pilu malei shira kayam. If our mouths were as full of song as the sea. So if you have little kids, this is a lot of fun to do, because you say, okay, make your mouth as big as the ocean. Right? Uloshonenu rina kehamon galav. And our tongues as powerful, tongues as filled with song as the waves. Right? Usfatenu shevach kamarkir rakia. And our lips as wide as the sky itself. And our eyes as bright as the sun and the moon, and our hands spread out like the eagles of the sky, and our legs as light and strong as the deer, if we had all of the expressive powers of nature. We couldn't possibly begin to give 1/100,000th of the thanks, of the gratitude that we owe God for the miracles of everyday life. So the first prayer says that praying is the most natural thing in the world. But the second prayer says, but there's a dilemma. How do you do it? How do you find the words? How do you express yourself? This is what Abraham Heschel, the philosopher, called the sense of the ineffable. To be standing before an experience that's inexpressible. It's an experience that's inexpressible. So with what words do you express the inexpressible? How do you point to the inexpressible? This is the dilemma of worship, of all worship, right? It's a dilemma of all ineffable experiences. So in the Bible, we have two modes of worship. We saw this last week. One mode of worship is prayer, verbal prayer, which is spontaneous and emotional and personal. Hannah needs a kid, so she's praying for a child, right? Noah Hannah gets the kid and she offers words of personal prayer is spontaneous and it comes from the moment. Then you have the book of Leviticus, which is what we're reading in Torah in synagogue today, and that introduces a new idea: organized communal worship, or what we like to call services. Okay? Organized communal worship is different than prayer. Prayer comes from the heart. Organized communal worship comes from an institution. It's an organized, set, scheduled, systematized, rule-based way of doing things. Highly articulated way of doing things. Now, what's supposed to happen is that these two things are supposed to either work parallel or together, right? So the tradition in the Leviticus today, over and over again, is going to say, bring your sacrifice, liratzon. Do it right. Do it right. And so you have in the sacrificial worship a very structured way of bringing your emotions to God, and in prayer a very spontaneous way of bringing your emotions to God. Two different parts of the human repertoire. Two different ways that human beings express their emotions. Right? What happens? What happens is that in the year 70, the Roman Empire, tired of governing rebellious, offensive Jews, decides to destroy Jerusalem. Right? We initiated a rebellion in 67. We killed off the garrison that was guarding the city. The Romans land the 10th Legion in Tyre, and they march down the coast, and they march up the hills, and they encircle the city of Jerusalem. And in the summer of the year 70, they destroy Jerusalem. They destroy the Temple of Jerusalem. That moment before the Holocaust was the greatest catastrophe in all of Jewish history. The greatest catastrophe, because here was the building, here was the city, here was the core of Jewish identity and Jewish life. First of all, that temple had stood on that spot since King Solomon had built it 1,000 years earlier. Right? It was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 and rebuilt by Ezra some years later, but fundamentally it had been there for 1,000 years. Very few buildings in Southern California have been there for 1,000 years. Right? My kids hate it when I go down Ventura Boulevard and tell them what everything used to be. I mean, they really, the Marshalls, that was a bowling alley, right? And where Ralph's was the Queen's Arms, where my friend had his bar mitzvah. And that was Ralph Williams' Fort across the street, and Tony Roma's was next to it. So and they said, "Oh, Dad, shut up. We don't want to hear what everything used to be." Because everything in the San Fernando Valley, anything in the San Fernando Valley that was built before 1970 is considered now classic mid-century. I had a real estate guy come to my door and say, "Do you know that you own a classic mid-century?" I own a crappy old house. What are you talking about? Oh, no, classic mid-century now. Pish posh, you know. But, you know, so in L.A., we're used to old architectures from the 30s, right? You drive around Hollywood and you see these, right? In New York, old architecture is from the, from the 1880s. You know, everything got built in the 1880s. In Boston, you know, you can live in a house. My brother lives in a house that was built in the early 19th century, right? It's his terrible plumbing. I mean, that's the problem. In England, an old, New College, Oxford was built in 1349 or something, right? In Israel, anything that's not anything built before 1500 is modern architecture, you know. So this building had been there 1,000 years. That's a big deal. Number two, this was the center of all of life. This was the center of Jewish religious life, of Jewish cultural life. The academies met there. The sacrifices were certainly offered. This was the core. Jews around the world, and they were, by the time the Romans arrived in Jerusalem in 70, there was a huge diaspora. There were Jews living all over the Mediterranean, from Spain all the way to India. And wherever they prayed, which way did they turn? Toward Jerusalem. You turn toward Jerusalem, right? Because that was the core of Jewish life. And religiously, this was the place where heaven and earth touched. The temple was the conduit between our needs and God's ears. This was the place where, so you made pilgrimage there if you could, on Pesach. And if you could go 3 times a year, you went 3 times a year. But you went to be in the temple because that's where God lived. And in the middle of the temple was a room called Kodesh HaKodeshim, which is where God had an office. God lived there. In the first temple, it had the Ark of the Covenant, till Harrison Ford found it. And the second temple, the room was empty, but God lived in that room. And only the high priest, and only on Yom Kippur did the high priest go into that room, because God lived in that room. And before he went into the room, they would tie a rope around his leg. In case the poor schnook would die in the middle of the ceremony, they could schlep him out. Nobody else would have to die. I mean, the idea was that God lived there. And that building was the conduit. And all of a sudden, it was gone. I mean, literally gone. And one afternoon in 70, the temple is destroyed. The priests are murdered. The sacrificial worship comes to an end. We lose the city of Jerusalem. It's all gone. And you can imagine the shock of the survivors. You can imagine the sense of disorientation, the sense of disequilibrium of the survivors, because it means that the whole world as I know it is now different. Now, what did they do? So I'm sure a bunch of them decided, well, this means that the Romans were right. Roman gods are strong, our gods weak. They became Romans. And I'm sure a bunch of Jews decided to become Romans. And a few Jews decided to follow the Christian way because they had an answer for the catastrophe. You rejected God's Messiah, this is your punishment. At least it wasn't a good answer, but it was an answer. And when you need an answer, you need an answer. But there were Jews who survived, and there were Jews who didn't want to let go of their faith. So there happened to be one last bastion of wisdom left in the world, and that was in the city of Yavne. Because the rabbis who opposed the revolution from the beginning had retreated and cut a separate peace with the Romans and retreated to the town of Yavne, which is down near the coast. So you can imagine this moment when the survivors of the destruction of Jerusalem come to the rabbis of Yavne. They stand in front of the rabbis and they ask them a great post-Holocaust question. What now? What's left of Jewish life now? Is this the end of the Jewish people? Is this the end of the Jewish mission? Is there any sense to Jewish life now? And I think the most bitter of questions had to be, does God hate us? Does God hate us? Has God rejected us? Is this the end of the covenant? After all, what kind of God would allow his temple, his people, his city to be destroyed, his priests to be destroyed? Is this the end of the covenant? It's a very powerful question, you know? Now, you can imagine the rabbis of Yavne had three possibilities sitting in front of them, seems to me. They could have said, yes, it's the end, go home. And they would have been right. I mean, they wouldn't have been wrong. I mean, when you think about how devastating that was. I mean, the same way, by the way, that at the end of the Holocaust, if rabbis had made that statement, it would have been very hard to argue with them. This is the end. There's no sense in going on for claiming what we proclaim because our world no longer makes any sense. That's an option. That's a live option. A second live option, which is perhaps more traditional, would have been, wait, God will show up one day. Right? Wait. Jews are good at waiting. Right? We've been waiting for 4,000 years. We're waiting. That's why we have the same word for hello and goodbye. Right? Wait, you know, God destroyed Pharaoh, God will destroy the Romans. That would have lasted about a generation. That would have lasted about a generation, because after a generation, the young would have said, enough waiting already. They said something else. They did something quite courageous and remarkable. They didn't say wait, and they didn't say goodbye. They said, this is the opportunity for something brand new. Now, there is no text that records what they actually said, but I happen to know what they actually said, right? I have it, family tradition. If you have the blue prayer book, it's on page 257. If you don't have it, I'll give it to you. I'm going to read it, so you don't have to go nuts. Right? You see, there's a book in the Mishnah, which is a book the rabbis are going to write 150 years later. And the Mishnah contains all of the oral traditions, the interpretive traditions of the Torah. But there's one book in the Mishnah which doesn't belong. It's not like the others. It has no controversy. It's very strange for Jews. And it has no law. It's simply wise sayings of the rabbis. And I think that what you have, especially in the first parak of Pirkei Avot, of this book, is the notes of what was said on that day, of what was exchanged on that day, that the survivors of the catastrophe came to the rabbis and said, what do we do? And I think this is what we have here. So let's do I want to do them quickly because I want to get to the one that's important. The Pirkei Avot begins with a preamble. And the preamble doesn't actually come from Pirkei Avot, it actually comes from someplace else in the Talmud. And it says, Kol Yisrael yesh them chelek le'olam haba. All Israel have a portion in the world to come. And the radical part of that statement is the word all. Because we're really good, Jews are really good, I don't know if you know this, of splitting. You know, all Jews are acceptable to God, except for the ones who daven in the temple. No, you know, all Jews are okay if you give to the, you know, if we add all these qualifications. So the rabbis start out with a general statement of radical inclusivity. I don't care who you were before. I don't care who you were before the destruction. It doesn't matter anymore. All those distinctions are wrong. They're all obsolete. All of you belong here. All of you belong here. You all have a place in God's world. You all have a place in the Jewish people. You all have a place here. The word is call, all. That's a remarkable statement. All. Which means, by the way, that we're going to have to figure out how, A, to talk to each other, because we come from very different ideological positions. And if we're going to have one unified community, we're going to have a standard of civility that allows us to exchange ideas without killing each other. We're not yet good at that. And two, we're going to have a standard of truth. We're going to have to create a theory of truth which allows for multiple positions, for plurality of positions. Because if we're going to have room for multiple ideologies within a unified people, we're going to have a recognition that there are lots of different ways of interpreting God's will. And this is what the rabbis set to work on. Well, the first principle is radical inclusivity. Second principle, Moshe kibel Torah miSinai. Moses got the Torah at Sinai, and he gave it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets to the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, the early rabbis. They gave it to the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishnah, who gave it to the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara, who gave it to the Saboraim, the guys who edited the Gemara, to the Gaonim, the great scholars of the yeshivas of the East. They gave it to the great scholars of the yeshivas of the West, who gave it to the philosophers, who gave it to Moses Maimonides, who gave it to Mordechai Kaplan, who gave it to Harold Schulweis, who gave it to me, and my job is to give it to you. Seriously, I don't mean that facetiously. I am part of a chain of generations of teachers. And you are too. We are all part of the chain of generations because what's passed down is Torah. Now notice what it's a very beautiful sleight of hand. You just lost the temple. You just lost your priest. You just lost your territory in the world. You just lost your place, your geographic place, and the rabbis say, irrelevant. You have something more important. You have a place more important. You have Torah. And as long as you grasp Torah, even if you have no geographical place, no political power, no material well-being, you have what you need. The core of Jewish life will no longer be a place, a government. The core of Jewish life will be an ideology which we call Torah. And what do you have to do with Torah? It says, be cautious in rendering decisions, rear many students, build a fence around it, which means adjudicate it so that it can be a lived law, teach it so it can be a growing, it's passed on generation to generation, and legislate whenever you need to. Legislate. Use your powers of imagination to extend the law of Torah. Okay? And then here's the one I want to get to. But the most important answer given on that day in 70 by the rabbis of Yavne to the survivors of the destruction was this one. Shimon HaTzadik, who had lived 3 generations earlier. He said, Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed, al Torah avodah gemilut chesed. The word, now there's 2 statements there. Statement 1, ha'olam omed. The world stands. You think your world has been destroyed. It doesn't. Your world stands. It's just a different world than you're used to before. And by the way, when he says ha'olam omed, you have to understand all the resonances of that. Okay? The Beit HaMikdash, the holy temple of Jerusalem, the one the Romans destroyed, stood on a piece of rock called Even HaShtiyah, which was considered the foundation stone of the universe. When the Romans destroyed it, they put fires around the temple, and the temple exploded, because the temple was built out of limestone covered with marble, and when you heat limestone, it explodes. The temple literally exploded. They thought Even HaShtiyah exploded. They literally thought the world was knocked off its axis, because the foundation stone of the universe was exploded. Now, it turns out it didn't explode. I mean, the temple exploded, but the rock was preserved. And today it's under that very attractive golden dome in Jerusalem, which is also known as the Dome of the Atazoi. That's the rock. Azoi, right? Right? Which, by the way, led to one of the great poetic turns in all of modern Jewish history. Because when they wrote the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, they had to figure out how do you compromise between religious people and anti-religious people. Because Ben-Gurion and his buddies were sort of anti-religious, but the religious were sitting at the table. And if you put God in the document, the anti-religious would have walked out of the room, Jews. And if you took God out of the document, the religious would have walked out of the room, Jews. So what did they do with the Declaration of Independence? Anybody happen to know? They didn't refer to God. They referred to Tzur Yisrael. Translation, the Rock of Israel, Tzur Yisrael. One man's theology is another man's geology. The religious said, Tzur Yisrael, that's the Kodesh Baruch Hu, that's God. And the anti-religious said, Tzur Yisrael, that's the land, the rock, the geology, the gravel of Israel. And that's how they had a compromise and created a state of Israel. We are really a clever people. We are a clever people. I mean, some days we're a clever people. Some days we're... Anyway, you don't want to know that stuff. So what happens? He says to them, Ha'olam omed. Yes, you lost something, but you didn't lose a world. What did you lose? You lost a building in Jerusalem. That's all. You lost a building in Jerusalem. And I'm going to tell you something else. It isn't that God was banished from the world. God was liberated. God was liberated. You see, as long as you believed that God lived in an office in Jerusalem, you had to turn in that direction. You had to turn in that direction to pray. But now, if you're in this room, you turn toward the Sefer Torah, because that's going to be the place that we access God. You're now going to access God in three new ways. Through Torah, through the learning of Torah, Avodah, which is now going to be verbal prayer, and Gemilut Chesed, acts of kindness. This is going to be the way that God enters your life now. You haven't lost God. You've gained new ways to access God. No more sacrifices, no more priests. Although you can pray about that someday in the future, but it's not going to happen in your lifetime. So learn how to pray, and learn how to do mitzvah, and learn how to learn Torah. I mean, this becomes the ideology of rabbinic Judaism, which will carry us through the years of the diaspora. It'll carry us through the years of the diaspora. So now the people asked this question. The question they asked was, but where is God now? I mean, because God used to be located. You knew where he was. He was in an office in Jerusalem. You know, had a nameplate on the door in fire, you know. Where is God now? So the rabbis reached back for an ideology that they found in the prophet Ezekiel, who was a prophet who lived during the first exile, when the temple was destroyed the first time in 586. And the people of Ezekiel's time asked him this question, Ayeh mekom kvodo. They put this in the prayers, by the way, so if you want to read it, if you happen to have the blue book, I'm sorry, if you happen to have the blue book on 157, right, in the middle of the page, right, Ayeh mekom kvodo. What is the place of God's glory? Where is the place of God's presence now in the world? And Yechezkel, because he lived in exile, because he knew that if he pointed to Jerusalem, it would destroy the people, it would break their hearts, he said something quite remarkable. Kvodo malei olam. Kvodo, God's presence, malei olam, fills the whole world. Now, consider that for a moment. If God lives in Jerusalem, then I have to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem to stand in front of God and bring a sacrifice. But if kvodo malei olam, if God's presence fills the world, and God can now be accessed through Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chesed, then even in Encino, California, you can live a full and whole Jewish life. You can live a whole Jewish life. Right now, you're thinking to yourself, yes, but what's the land of Israel all about? We'll come back to that. That's a really interesting question about whether the land of Israel is intrinsically valuable to the Jewish people or instrumentally valuable. Does it make possible Jewish life, or is it itself Jewish life? We'll come back to that. But the idea that God's presence fills the whole world. Now, why don't you know that? Why don't you know that? Because you're trying not to whack the car in front of you on the freeway. Because you're trying to get to Ralph's before they close. Because you're trying to get to your tennis game before your partner leaves. Because you're busy people living normal lives, and you don't stop to reflect on the fact that God is with you all the time, in all moments, and in all experiences. So what did the rabbis do about that? They created a mantra. A mantra is an old Yiddish word. It means a meditation formula to get you to stop and pay attention to this theology I'm trying to teach you. And the theology I'm trying to teach you, they said, is that divinity is present to you in all moments, in all things, in all possibilities. You just have to stop and notice it. The problem isn't metaphysical. That is, the problem isn't that God is so far away and inaccessible to you. The problem is psychological. The problem is yours. You're not paying attention, right? The kids like to ask me, if God spoke to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel and Leah and Moses and Aaron, God kept speaking to everybody in the Bible, how come God don't talk to nobody today? So I said, I'll go ask. And I came back and I said to the kids, this is what she told me. God said that she won't talk to anybody who watches television. The kid said to me, really? I said, no, I'm kidding. But it's true, right? But here's the answer. It's the one answer is to say, well, we're not as holy as they were, so. But there's a better answer. The problem isn't that God's not speaking. The problem is that we're not listening. God's talking all the time. That's why the most important statement in the whole prayer book is not worship God, obey God, do God's will. The most important word in the whole prayer book is Shema Yisrael, which means what? Shut up and listen, Jews. New? I put the new part in. That's not in the Torah. But the idea that, listen. So the rabbis have this ideology that God is liberated when the temple is destroyed, not banished. And if God is liberated from locality, from locus, and allowed to live in all the world, then the question is, how do I get you to face God? And the answer is with a mantra. And you all know this. You just don't know that you know it this way. Here's the mantra. You ready? Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, darumpty-dump. Now the darumpty-dump part is whatever you happen to be doing at the moment. So if you're about to eat a donut, right, it's borei minei mezonot, okay? If you happen to be ready to eat an apple, it's borei priya eitz, right? If you happen to be, whatever you're doing, that's the darumpty-dump part, which means that I want to stop for a moment and recognize the presence of divinity in the act I'm about to commit, in the thing I'm about to do. And the word Baruch atah Adonai melech haolam, badly translated as blessed art thou, Lord God, right? Let's retranslate it a minute, okay? The word Baruch means a blessing. It's true, but it has two other resonances, two other meanings. Hebrew is a language of three-letter roots, and three-letter roots, it suggest each other. So one of the roots of the word Baruch is berech, which means knee. And the verb for knee is to kneel. I kneel in front of somebody. Now, when do you kneel in front of somebody? We don't do that a lot, we Jews. We're pretty good at standing up straight. But there are a couple of times in life when you kneel in some front. You kneel when you're in front of somebody who you acknowledge is now the center of your life. Those of us, some of us got married by kneeling in front of somebody. Got down on a knee and you said to this person, be my partner. And the person said, what? Are you kidding? No, it said, of course, right? You kneel. Why does the groom kneel before the bride, as it were? Because it's a sign that you are the center of my life. Right? You kneel before a monarch in the medieval tradition because you're acknowledging fealty. You kneel before God, which means I recognize you're here. I acknowledge. The word kneel means to acknowledge. The other meaning of the word is the word brecha. In camp we had to learn this word because the word brecha means swimming pool. But in the Bible, before we had swimming pools, we had springs. If you're traveling through the desert and you're thirsty and you're hot and you come upon an oasis and there's a brecha, there's a pool of water there, first you say, a bruch, blessing, right? But the notion that there's a spring of blessing, a spring of life, a spring. So some of the feminist writers who are trying to take away the hierarchy and the masculinity of the traditional prayers use the phrase Ein HaChaim, spring of life. I acknowledge you, spring of life. It's a beautiful idea. Brecha, the well of life, the spring of life, the well of being. I acknowledge this well of being. I acknowledge the spring of life. I kneel, I acknowledge. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, that's God's moniker. Melech ha'olam. Melech, of course, is king. Ha'olam is all of space and time. Olam is a great word because it means world, but it also, you use le'olam va'ed, which means time. It means the world of space and time. Feinstein would have been proud because it means both space and time. Melech ha'olam, a God who inhabits the infinity of space and time, is revealed to me in this apple. In this apple. This apple contains divinity. Now, what you're trying to do is trying to get a human being to slow down a moment and acknowledge that, and acknowledge that, and acknowledge that divinity is right in front of me. That's the great rabbinic invention. That was what the rabbis gave the Jewish people after the destruction of the temple. Because the question was, has God abandoned us? Has God rejected us? Does God hate us? And the answer is no. But you're going to access God in a very different way than you did before. You're not going to make pilgrimage to a building in Jerusalem and offer animal sacrifices. You're going to stop for a moment before eating an apple and recognize that you're part of a great chain of being. And that divinity is present to you as you recognize divinity in that chain of being. That's what the bracha means. That's the beginning of Jewish prayer, okay? I see we got a couple of questions, so let's get some questions. Douglas, you have the mic, so you better ask first. Then give it to Billy.
Have the rabbis come to this conclusion before the destruction of the temple and the world kind of evolved to their way of thinking, or did they develop it as a response to the destruction?
I don't know. We don't have text to that extent. I just know what they did afterwards, right? So I suspect that none of this is new. But a lot of this was developing within the rabbinic community and within the world, but it was published, as it were, by the necessity of the destruction. The destruction demanded that we have an answer to this question. Otherwise, the people would have left. I mean, they were worried about losing the Jewish people at that point, right? Otherwise, the people would have left, right? And that becomes the effective way of keeping us together as a people.
Did the destruction form an act of liberation, allowing a more sophisticated understanding of God?
Well, I think so, yeah. There are other people who think that sacrifices was the better way, right? Maimonides thought that sacrifices was just a compromise to the culture of the time, and that there could be nothing grosser than shechting animals and burning them and eating them, and that prayer was a midpoint where you had a set tradition of prayer, and eventually we would even give up prayer and adopt simple philosophical contemplation as worship. That was the Rambam. But of course the Rambam, they burned his books. I mean, so he was never a majority thinker. But, yeah. And if you go to Jerusalem today, I'll be right with you. If you go to Jerusalem today, there's a yeshiva across the street from the Kotel where they're getting ready for the day that Messiah will come and the temple will be destroyed, and they're training young men how to shecht animals and burn them for sacrifices. They believe that this is the apotheosis of, I respectfully disagree. I don't look forward to seeing dead animals all over the Bima Valley, Beth Shalom.
Rabbi, I'd like to ask, so I've gone to Chabad a lot, and they seem to be emphasizing the desire in the prayers to rebuild the temple.
Yeah.
So if the destruction of the temple is freeing Hashem,
yeah,
why are we praying for the return of the rebuilding of the temple?
What a wonderful question. And when you go to Chabad next, ask the rabbi that question.
Okay, I'll do that.
Seriously, I mean, ask the rabbi if he seriously thinks, if the question has to do with, within traditional circles, the prayer is to rebuild the temple of Jerusalem. Yibana Beis HaMikdash, right?
Rabbi?
Now, wait 1 second. Some rabbis will tell you that's a symbol of an intimacy between the Jewish people and God. That the temple was an intimacy, and that's what we're looking for. Other people, as I said, there's this yeshiva in Jerusalem where they're mamish preparing, they're sharpening the knives. So some people really believe we're going to go back to animal sacrifice. Me, no. I'm a Maimonidean in that sense. I think that's a wonderful question to ask the rabbi there, if he truly believes that that's the way that God wants us to worship, or if we have outgrown that form of worship because we think of God in very different ways than they thought of God 2,000 years ago. I think see, there's the answer. I think that's a marvelous question to ask. I really do. To me, those lines, when I read them in the prayer book, I read them symbolically and poetically. I don't take them literally at all. Right? But the problem is that there are many people who take them very literally. The real problem, of course, politically, and I don't want to get into this, but is that there's some people who are so zealous for that they think they can hurry that up by carrying out certain acts of political violence against those who now inhabit the Temple Mount. And that would be rather catastrophic, I think. So I think it's a great question to go ask your rabbi and see what he said. Bring us back the answer, okay?
On the same note, just
Wait, hang on. Yeah.
some Jews do not believe in the existence of the state of Israel until the Messiah.
My God, you're right. You know what? Some Jews don't believe in just about anything you can name. I mean, that's the most wonderful thing. Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek le'olam haba, which is another way of saying we got Jews who believe in everything. Let God worry about them. You know? Yes, Ron.
Rabbi, if the Romans beat us,
Yeah.
that means their God is stronger than our God.
That's what they said.
So why should we work so hard to keep our God alive?
Yeah, and I don't believe that the gods of the Red Sox are stronger than the gods of the Dodgers, even though they beat us rather handily, you know. Yeah, well, that's part of it. We're the Romans now. That's part of it, and I don't read that war as a theological war. I don't believe it's a war of gods against gods. I think I think that the Jews did a couple of the rabbis of the Talmud asked the question, Ronnie, why did we lose that war? They asked the question. By the way, it's a live question, because even though we think of the Roman Empire as this invincible power, that's how the movies present them, you know, Spartacus, right? The truth of the matter is, those of us who have some sense of the recent American history, think of Roman Palestine like Rome's Vietnam. The Roman Empire was an empire vastly overextended, right? Vastly overextended. You have this rebellion in a very wealthy province off to the east. The Romans were worried about it for several reasons. Number one, if on the east of Israel were the Persians, and the Persians were already pushing on the eastern end of the Roman Empire. And if they lost Palestine, the Persians would overrun the eastern end of the Roman Empire. That was problem number one. Problem number two was that a very large percentage of the Roman Empire was Jewish and supported the rebellion. Right? The Romans didn't want to destroy the temple. Even the Talmud acknowledges that. But we forced them to do it because we kept this rebellion going. And then at the moment of truth, the third reason we lost is because we couldn't fight together as one. There was a fight within the city among the Jewish fighters against each other over who would be the commander of the war. You all know this place called Masada? You've all been there? And you know the great story of Masada, how the Zealots held out. Wait a minute. The Zealots were the guys who started the war against the Romans. What the hell were they doing on Masada? Well, what happened is that there was a war within the city. Jews against Jews, while the Romans were besieging the city. The Zealots realized they weren't going to win the war, so they left the city and went and hid out at Masada. They left the city, they started the war against the Romans, and then they decided not to stay and defend the city, and that's why they're on Masada? That makes it a little less heroic. So what do we learn from this? If we Jews can't get it together, it's not a matter of the gods. The rabbis of the Talmud interpret this as our own damn fault. That we could have at least sued for some sort of peace from the Romans, but we were too busy fighting among each other to figure out how to do this right. I wouldn't say that. See, you're already casting political aspersions, and I wouldn't know.
Apropos of what you're saying,
we're going to get to the prayer book, I promise you.
It seems one of the miracles is that these people accepted and embraced this new theology when, as Ronnie was saying, they were defeated, and the rabbis could go on and on. But the miracle to me is that the people were accepted this. And the second thing.
Well, no,
about,
it could go the other way around, Bill. It's not the miracle that they accepted it. It's the ones who accepted it are your friends, are your Jews. I mean, this is when people became. Jews deserted to the Christian community. Jews deserted to the Roman. You don't know the Jews who deserted to the Roman community because they're Romans today, not Jews. Right?
Yeah. The second thing is that in biblical archaeology, Israeli settlements are identified by the lack of pig bones.
Yeah.
They have not found any bone remnants that would address how many animals would need to be sacrificed.
Yeah. Right.
So it might not have ever happened.
What, sacrifice?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure that happened. I'm sure it happened. I mean, you had a temple in Jerusalem, then you didn't have the kind of numbers the Bible describes because those are ridiculous. But you had sacrifices. We did sacrifices. Everybody did sacrifices. No, that's not true. They found altars. They found altars all over the place. Well, I don't know. They had carry-out, so they. All right. So what did the rabbis do? So the rabbis arrive at this idea that verbal prayer will now be the principal way that Jews worship. And then they decided to do something really interesting. They took the tradition from sacrifice of an organized, communal, traditional, set-up, rule-based service, and they applied it to prayer. So in the morning, in the Temple of Jerusalem, a sacrifice was offered. It was called the Tamid. So in the morning, they said, we will have a prayer service. And just like the Tamid has certain rules, certain animals were offered in certain order, in certain ways, we will have a service that offers prayers in certain orders, in certain ways. Late in the afternoon, before evening, there was a sacrifice called the Mincha. So there would be a service in the afternoon. They took this idea of organized, rule-based worship and applied it to prayer. So the first rubric was sacrifice. You have a Tamid, a Shachrit, and a Mincha, right? The second rubric they chose was the Shema. And they had been reciting the Shema for a long time, since the Torah. And the Shema says you'll say it when you go to bed and when you rise up. And the rabbis determined that meant not literally when you go to bed and rise up, but at the time when people go to bed and the time when people rise up. So there's a morning Shema and an evening Shema. So now you end up with 3 services during the day. You have a Shachrit, you have a Mincha, and you have a Mariv, okay? The rabbis created, they give us the Shema, so you say the Shema in the morning and the Shema at night, at Shachrit and Mariv. And for the sacrifice, they created a new prayer which would replace the sacrifice, and that was the Amidah. So the Shachrit service has a Shema and an Amidah. The Mincha service has an Amidah but no Shema. And the Mariv service is supposed to have a Shema but no Amidah, but they snuck one in anyway. But this idea of a rule-based prayer service is a creation of the rabbis. You see this? Now here's another thing that they did. You made pilgrimage. So you started out from Tarzana, went to LAX, flew to Israel, got off at the airport in Ben Gurion, right? But now you wanted to make pilgrimage, so you didn't take a sherut up to Jerusalem or a taxi, right? You walked. You walked up the hill of Jerusalem, and when you got to that last turn, from that last vantage, you could begin to see the golden stones of the city of Jerusalem. You walked down, up again to the city, across the city to the gates of the city, through the gates of the city, and up to the Temple Mount. Okay, you went to a mikvah, put on a white gown, and you walked up to the Temple Mount. Now the Temple Mount was organized, it was a colonnade around the Temple Mount, and it was organized in a series of courtyards. The first courtyard was the courtyard of the nations. Everyone was allowed to be there. A lot of business went on there. Okay? Then you went through a gate, and there was a courtyard of the Israelites. And that was the courtyard where you brought your sacrifice. A Levite would meet you there and ask you who you were. And you'd say, you're Gelman from Long Island. He'd say, oh, I've heard of you. Right? And Gelman would bring his sacrifice, and the Levite would talk to him about what sacrifice he wanted to offer and why he was there. Right? And then in the middle of that courtyard, right in front of the Beit HaMikdash itself, was an altar. You could not approach the altar, but the Levite would take you with him, and he would approach the altar. Then there was a screen, and behind the screen was another altar, a smaller altar, and then the doors of the temple itself. The temple itself had two rooms, an outer room and an inner room. The outer room was a room where some worship was offered, incense was offered, bread was offered, and then there was a screen there. It was a fabric screen, and behind that was the Kodesh HaKodeshim, the Holy of Holies, that nobody went into. Nobody went into. Now watch what happens. When the rabbis put the prayers together, they decided to mimic the stages of that pilgrimage. They decided to mimic the stage of the pilgrimage. So the first stage of the pilgrimage is you're climbing up the Temple Mount and entering the court of the nations. That's Birkot HaShachar. That is the early part of the service, which deals with the physicality of being a human being. We'll look at some of these prayers in a moment. But it talks about us not as Jews, but as just physical beings. What does it mean to be able to wake up in the morning and open your eyes and breathe and feel the cool air on your skin and put on something warm and have something to eat? It's the physicality. The Birkot HaShachar deal with the experience of all humanity. That's our climbing the Temple Mount and entering the court of the nations, because that's the worship we share with all who are alive. Okay? Then we're going to walk to the court of the Jews. That's Psukei de Zimra. Because the Levites were there singing songs. Psukei de Zimra are the songs the Levites sang. And these are the songs of the Jewish people praising God for the gifts of covenant. And we're going to walk up to that altar with the priest. That's the Shema. The Shema is our pledge of allegiance. It's our attachment to the people Israel. It's the most Jewish thing you can do. And being there with the priest, offering your offering on that altar, is your commitment, your connection to God. Now, you and I, unless you're a Kohen, anyone here a Kohen? If you're a Kohen, don't listen to the next. Just ordinary Yidden like me, Jews like me, could not go beyond that point, right? But a Kohen could. The Kohen would go into the outer room of the temple. There's two rooms, inner and outer. The outer room of the temple where the incense was offered, where the bread of the covenant was offered, the Kohen could go there and offer our prayers for God. We can't go there except what the rabbis imagined was, now that there's no temple and we're doing this in our imagination, let's go. That's the Amidah. The first three blessings of the Amidah are we get to enter into the outer room of the temple. And then we get to do something which nobody but the high priest does. We get to enter into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. That's called the Kedusha in the Amidah. The structure of the morning prayer service, the evening prayer service a little bit like this, but the morning one particularly, mimics the pilgrimage into the Holy of Holies. And then it's time to leave. Now, you're not allowed to just turn your back and walk out. You've got to back out. So there are brachot of the Amidah following the Kedusha that represent going back out to the outer room of the temple. And then the closing prayers of the service mimic backing out into the court of the Jews, where the altar is, and then backing out to the court of the nations. The ending prayers, Ein Keloheinu and Adon Olam, represent our backing out and coming out of the place. If you follow the structure, the poetry of the service, you're making a pilgrimage up to Jerusalem. So for the Jew who lived in Lithuania or Romania or Spain or Babylon or India, generations and generations later, when it was impossible to get to Jerusalem and the temple was gone, the truth is that every morning when he put on his tefillin, every morning when she stood to pray, she made the pilgrimage all over again. Every time we pray, we make this pilgrimage. And that's why each of these different prayer services has its own level of concentration that's required of it. It escalates. So the Kedusha is the highest form of concentration because you're literally standing face to face with God. And then you back out of the experience. That's how the service was put together. Who put the service together? A guy named Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel was the Nasi of the generation of the destruction. His son, so now we're living in about the year 120. His son, who realized the temple's not being recreated anytime soon. Jews are going to need a structure of prayer. he put together the first prayer book for us. The first prayer book was Shimon ben Gamliel's. So if you happen to have the blue prayer book, turn to page 28. If you happen to have the red prayer book, turn to page 137. 28 or 137. Everybody got it? The original prayer book of Shimon ben Gamliel in the year 120 did not look like this. It really only had 3 lines, not this whole paragraph. Well, 4 lines. The first line of the prayer that Shimon ben Gamliel put was Baruch Hu. Baruch Hu was a call to prayer. So imagine it's evening time, and we're all in the marketplace. And we're all at our booths selling our wares and our crafts and our produce, and it's evening time, and it's time to pray. So we'll say, Arnie, pray for us. So Rabbi Stiebel would come to the middle of the courtyard, and he'd kick over an apple crate, and he'd stand up on the apple crate, and he'd sing out, Baruch Hu et Adonai Amvarach. Ladies and gentlemen, the evening has come, it's time to come and pray. And we would all respond, Baruch Adonai Amvarach leolam vaed. Let me unload this ugly rug on this stupid tourist, I'll be right there. Things haven't changed in 2,000 years. Now the next thing was not this whole paragraph. I'll tell you where the paragraph came from later. But first, I want you to see that the paragraph begins with the words, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, and then ends with the words, Baruch atah Adonai mariv aravim. That's all that was there. Just the last line and a few words of the first line. Evening time. This is a prayer about evening. Erev means evening. Mariv, Erev, evening, right? Evening time has come. The sun is coming down. And it's Arnie is going to pray for us. In the original prayer service of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Arnie would have to make up a prayer. Or whoever was going to lead the prayer would have to make up a prayer. And they'd have to talk to us about how evening time brings to mind that God is present in this moment. How is evening a time of God's presence? How is God's presence? So you'd have to think of a time in your life, some enchanted evening, when you met God during the evening sunset. When the sunset touched you in some manner. Or if it's not literally a sunset, it could be sunset as a metaphor. There are sunsets of relationships, sunsets of careers, sunsets of all kinds of things, and God is found in those moments. And the person praying would have to make up a prayer at that moment. Spontaneously make it up. Let me tell you something. And that meant 2 things. Number 1, that the person who prayed had to trust us, because he's about to unload his heart on all of us. He's going to tell us something from his own inner experience that the rest of us may not know. And number 2, that if you've been praying with the same people for a while, you got to know them really well, because they told you all kinds of things about themselves that you didn't know. Right? Now, that's how prayer originally was. It was completely improvisational. It was structured in the sense that it gave us the theme, Baruch atah Adonai mariv aravim, but what you said up until that point was yours. You had to say it yourself. You had to make it up yourself. Much shorter prayer book. How did we get this? Answer. Well, Jews, we're good at stuff. We're good at words. So there were groups of people, guys, men and women, mostly men, who were really good improvisational poets. These people were called a chazan. The word chazan today is translated as cantor, a guy with a beautiful voice and a strange disposition. But in those days, the word chazan comes from the Hebrew chazon, which means to see. It means to be able to perceive something. The chazan was the one who could see to the heart of existence, who could see to the heart of life. Now, chazan it was almost like hip-hop, or like rap artists, because the chazan would walk into our community and he'd say, give me 2 chickens, I'll daven for you. So, okay, fine, so you paid him 2 chickens, right? And he'd say, okay, who gave us the chickens? He'd say, okay, we got a chicken from Mort here. So, okay, Mort, right? Tell me the names of your kids. So Mort would give us the name of his kids, and the guy would make up a poem using the first letter of everybody's name. On the spot. Just amazing. It was verbal virtuosity, right? And he'd make, or he had a prayer that he made up, that he brought with him, that was beautiful. Now, the next day, that chazan would move on to the next community. He'd go to Adar Ariel, see if he can get better chickens. And it was Arnie's turn to daven again. And Arnie comes to say, listen, I'm going to lead the prayers, but you know, I'm kind of embarrassed because my poetry is not nearly as nice as the guy that was here last night. But tell you what, I wrote it down. I wrote down what the guy said last night. So here's what instead of giving you my Mariv Aravim, I'm going to read what the guy did last night. And that's how you end up with written prayers, scored prayer instead of improvisational prayer. And pretty soon, communities would collect books of these things. You know, these cantors would come by and they'd leave us their texts, right? So we had a book of them. You know, so in our community, we prayed this one or this one, and we'd stick them all together. And sometimes, you know, it's like the greatest hits. Like, you know, give me a better one, you know, or put 2 or 3 of them together. That answers the great question, by the way, which is the question all of you want to know. It's like, why are the services so long? And the answer is because we collected all this great poetry over the years, and we didn't want to let go of any of it. So we stuck it in a book. And then when printing was invented, what did printers do? They printed everybody's version of the prayer. Because the more versions of the prayer they could stick in the prayer book, the more prayer books he'd sell. Everything's capitalist in the end, right? It's a Marxist interpretation of the Siddur. Right? But you see what happened here is we lost something. We gained something and lost something. What did we gain? We gained a beautiful tradition of poetry. Because that's what the prayer book is. It's the greatest hits of the Jewish tradition. It's the greatest hits of the Jewish Middle Ages. It's the collection of the finest representations of Jewish spiritual life of the last 2,000 years. That's what a prayer book is. What did we lose? We lost permission to make up our own prayers. Because when you're faced with this, you say, I better read this. I better read this. So let's try an experiment for just a minute. Let's try this, okay? So for a moment, don't look at the prayer book. Look up. Tell me about a sunset that changed your life. A sunset where you met God. A sunset that just shattered everything and started it all over again. A sunset that moved your heart. A sunset where God showed up in your life. Think about that moment. Think of a sunset that touched you. Just think for a second. Hang on. Okay. Who has one they'd like to share? Would anyone have the courage to share this with us? Someone to share. Okay, hang on. We're going to bring you a microphone. You're going to be immortal here.
When I was in Israel with you, we were at the Knesset.
Yes.
And we saw a sunset that was unbelievable,
Yeah.
and I felt God.
Yeah? What was special about it?
The colors.
Yeah.
The colors, the magnificent composition and design. I mean,
Yeah.
no artist could make a painting like that.
Okay, so listen to that Mariv, okay? Ready? It goes like this. It would go like this, right? Sunsets all over the world are beautiful, but there's something special about the sunsets of Jerusalem. And we stood on the steps of the Knesset, and we watched the sun set over the horizon, and the skies filled with the colors of the rainbow that were reflected on the golden stones of the holy city. Baruch atah Adonai Hamariv Aravim. That's beautiful. Thank you. Who's got another one? Who's got one? Who's got a sunset? I need another one. Come on. Over here. Ronnie.
Thank God.
Wait, hang on. You're going to give me immortal. Here you go.
Thank you, God, for letting me be among my people.
Okay. So among your people fills you with light. Okay, good. Farza?
When I see the sunset, especially in the ocean
Yeah.
or in a mountain,
Yeah?
always I think this sunset is going to go to another country right now.
Yeah.
It's going to be
Oh, that's kinda nice.
sunrise and give me the hope that it's another day for me. Is coming.
Okay, that's a beautiful one. So when I stand at the ocean and watch the sunset into the horizon, and the colors fill the sky and my day comes to an end, I am reminded that on the other side of the world, there are people just like me, watching the sunrise and a new day beginning, that every ending is the beginning. Baruch atah Adonai, hamariv aravim. Do you see how that works? That's what it was supposed to be. That's what it was supposed to be. Now, what would happen if we did that? I mean, you might become impatient because each of us has different experiences. But you'd have to learn to listen to. We'd have to learn to listen to each other. We'd have to learn how to appreciate each other's experiences. And we would gain a sense of who we are from the experiences that we shared. This improvisational kind of prayer, which is personal and emotional and touching, that's the way Shimon ben Gamliel meant it to be in the beginning. It evolved in a very different direction, but that was the way it was meant to be. It was a reflection on where God finds God's place in the experiences of life. Brian and then the rabbi. Wait, hang on. Please, thank you.
There's a flavor here of finding something holy in everyday events.
Perfect. That's exactly the point. Finding something holy in the ordinary. Finding something mystical and powerful in the everyday. Now let me show you one more thing before the rabbi tells me I'm wrong. If in the blue book on page 29, in the red book on the bottom of the page. So here we have another prayer. Here's how you get the prayer. Look at the last line. Find the line that begins with the words Baruch atah Adonai. That tells you what the theme of the prayer is. So this one is Baruch atah Adonai Ohev Amo Yisrael, God who loves the people Israel. So I would ask you this question. When in your life did you know you were loved?
Almost every day.
No, but that's beautiful. Hug your wife. hug your husband.
That's why I said almost.
Run like hell. No, seriously. This prayer asks, they all ask you a question. They're asking you for your own experiences. When in your life, either did you know you were loved, or when in your life did you ever discover the capacity to love? Did you discover the capacity to love, right? And if you go through the prayer book, all over the prayer book, you're going to find these paragraphs or these pages. Look for the last line, the one that says, Baruch atah Adonai, and ask yourself, what of my experiences is reflected in that prayer? Okay, Rabbi, please.
Well, first of all, I think your summation of the history of tefillah is just brilliant, and I don't think really there's anything to really add to it or dissent from it, actually. However, my teacher, my friend,
we have this down
the savior of my life.
We have this down.
You've explained the different moments of prayer.
Yeah.
So now a question.
Yes.
How many different kinds of prayers, not just in Jewish prayer, but in all prayer from all people here on planet Earth, how many different types of prayer do you think exist? Now, the alternatives, there's 8 billion different types because of the number of people, is certainly not true because of the repetition of certain tropes. So when I taught children, and in a new book which is called Thanks, Gimme, Oops, and Wow, I have asked generations of my students, how many different kinds of prayers are there? Mm-hmm. And I have reduced it to a list of 4.
Okay.
I would ask you if you believe this list is comprehensive enough. Thanks.
Yeah.
Prayers that obviously hodot, that thank God for giving us. There's bakashot, there's prayers of petition, gimme, thanks, gimme, and most people think of all prayer as gimme prayers. Petition. Oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? Right? Gimme. Oops. Oops prayers are vidui prayers of I made a mistake, I ask your forgiveness. And wow are all of the sunset,
wonder prayers,
hodot,
right.
the prayers of awe.
Right.
is there a fifth kind of prayer, or do those four, thanks, gimme, oops, and wow, encompass all forms of prayer in your
I think it's a good summary. I think it's a very fine summary. I can't think of a fifth one. I mean, I'm sure there's something. But what I find interesting, and we'll finish with this, what do those four have in common?
Thanks, gimme, oops, and wow?
Yeah, they all have in common that my existence is not bounded by my own ego. They all have in common an explosion of the boundaries of my existence. When I say thanks, what I'm saying is I'm not the author of my own good fortune. Right?
Everything is a gift.
It's a gift, and there's something beyond me. My narrative fits into a larger narrative of the world, and I recognize that, right?
Diminishes selfishness, increases gratitude.
Exactly right. Diminishes selfishness, increases gratitude, expands the boundaries of ego, right? The problem that the service is dealing with is the problem of ego. Is the person who thinks I am the author of my own existence and nothing besides me exists. It's infantile egotism, which an awful lot of people never grow out of. So thanks, I recognize that it's a gift. Give me, I recognize that I'm incomplete and I can't do it alone. I can't do it alone, right? Oops, I recognize that I'm responsible to that which is beyond me. And wow, I'm just taken with the fact that the world is so much bigger than me. It's all about exploding the ego, because the problem is that the person who lives with this constricted, tight ego, that person's impossible to live with, for one thing, and destructive. But more than that, that's not a life. There's nothing. That person is going to soon discover that life is a dead end. And so to explode the ego through these kinds of prayer, I think you're right. I think those are the.
A Buddhist friend of mine.
Yeah.
A Buddhist friend added a fifth. I'm not sure whether it's right or not.
Yeah.
He said there's a fifth type of prayer, and that is silence, where basically the prayer gets you to remove your ego by removing your words.
That's interesting. Or, you could even go to the questions: is there peace? A prayer of inner peace.
Is a wordless prayer a prayer?
Yeah, but I'm wondering whether a nigun, for example, but the question is there a prayer? Is there?
That's a really good example.
Is there a state of inner peace? Is there a state of inner stillness and peace that counts as prayer, that functions in the same way? That's what a Buddhist would point to, and that's a very, very interesting question. That I don't know. That's a very beautiful question. Next week we're going to open the prayer book, and we're going to get into the heart of the Shema, which is the first section of Jewish prayer, and what it means to pledge allegiance to God. Please join us for Rabbi. For services now and Mr. Milstein's talk at 11:30. Thanks very much, everyone. Stay well.
Shabbat Shalom. I wanted to tell you, we were